Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I have the greatest pleasure in welcoming all of you on this Saturday evening Indian time, afternoon Geneva time, to what promises to be a scintillating conversation on issues scientific. This is one of those seasons when science is in fashion. Everybody thinks he or she is a scientist, and that's why it's important to find a real scientist to make sense of what's happening in the world right now. What's this tiny little virus? As I keep saying, in fact, I read this in an article in the Atlantic. If you expand it to the size of a football, if you put it on a football field, it'll be like 4 centimeters. That's small. But this virus is holding the whole world to ransom. So our guest today, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, Chief Scientist at World Health Organization in Geneva, among the most preeminent and famous and respected Indian scientists in the field of health, biology. Dr. Swaminathan trained at Armed Forces Medical College, did her internship with the forces, and then specialized to be a pediatrician, and as a pediatrician also as a super specialist for pediatric tuberculosis. So she has dedicated her entire life to research. Before this, she was at a very young age, if I may say so, she was the Director General of Indian Council of Medical Research. Her successor now it is, who's now spearheading India's scientific effort against the coronavirus pandemic. So Dr. Swaminathan, after that slightly long introduction, but you deserve it. I think every scientist of repute now deserves it. Welcome to this very special edition of Off the Cuff. Can you hear me all right, I hope?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much, Shekhar. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Pleasure to be with you on the show.
Thank you very much. So let me begin. First of all, you are sitting in the hottest seat you've sat on in your life. I mean, the whole world is looking at WHO, and I presume WHO is looking at you because you had the scientific team. So give us in 2 minutes the science of what's going on.
Okay. Bit challenging, but let me try. Because we're learning every day. And so what I say today will be already outdated tomorrow.
Well, qualified as of today.
Yes, let's start with the 31st of December, when the local health authority of Wuhan notified through the Chinese authorities to WHO that they had seen an unusual cluster of pneumonia cases happening in Wuhan. And so that's the first that WHO got to know about it. We set up immediately the incident management support team, which is a team that is immediately put in place whenever there's any hint of an emergency. And this is across the 3 levels of the organization: headquarters here in Geneva, the regional office, which in this case is the Western Pacific Regional Office in Manila, and the China country office. And on an emergency footing, you start investigating and finding out more. On the 4th of January, we reported on social media that something unusual was going on. And on the 5th, we put out something called the disease outbreak news. This tells people that there is an outbreak somewhere, and it gives as much detail as available. And on the 10th of January already, we put out a technical package because on the 11th, we were informed by the Chinese authorities that this was a coronavirus. And in fact, they had already sequenced the gene and had deposited the sequence in a public database. This is very important to note because it sets the stage for many things that happen after that. And on the 14th of January, our technical teams did talk about the possibility of human-to-human transmission, knowing that the previous coronaviruses, the SARS virus and the MERS virus, are the 2 ones that everyone remembers because they were rather serious. But we must remember there are 4 other coronaviruses which in fact cause the common cold. They cause about 30% of upper respiratory infections in humans. So this is the 7th coronavirus that is known to us. And so knowing the other coronaviruses, we said this is how it's likely to spread through droplet transmission. and therefore all precautions should be taken, and healthcare workers should be particularly vigilant. And then going on from there, of course, then the emergency committee met on the 22nd and 23rd of January. They were not convinced that it was an international emergency because there were very few cases outside of Wuhan or outside of China at that time. But on the 30th of January, they were reconvened by the Director General, and at that time, they then declared it a public health emergency of international concern. We must remember at that time that there were only 82 cases outside of China. And in fact, it was the same day the first case in India was actually found positive in Kerala. So that's the highest level of an emergency threat that the WHO can actually make based on the international health regulations. So at that time, we had already called it the highest possible threat. And of course, after that, the other thing I would like to mention is that we also put in place very quickly the research and development plan. And I think this is important, Shekhar, because you were talking about science. On the 10th of January itself, even before we knew very much about this virus, we convened the international group that we call the Global Coordinating Mechanism of the R&D Blueprint. The R&D Blueprint is a mechanism that was set up after Ebola of 2015 in order to activate research and development for new tools, for any new pathogens. And I can say a little more in detail about that later. But the fact is that we also started working on the science, on the research, on generating knowledge through our network of experts, starting from the 10th of January. So that's just a glimpse into the early part of this outbreak. Since then, of course, we have been learning more and more. It's taken off in many countries. And in fact, we've seen explosive outbreaks across Europe and across North America, which have really overwhelmed health systems. We have learned much more about how to diagnose it and how to manage it. And perhaps we can talk a little bit more about that.
So what do we know about this virus that we didn't know, say, 3 weeks back? And do you agree also with people who say that this virus is running faster than scientists, faster than politicians, and definitely faster than bureaucracies?
Yes, and unfortunately, we had known that such a thing would happen in the world. Of course, no one ever could have imagined it would have happened right now at this moment, and it would have taken this kind of a shape. But if you look back at the documents that the WHO produces, and that many scientists really have been saying, a few things are important. We've known that the world will face a pandemic. And in fact, the Director General had said last year that it's not a question of if, but a question of when. Most people thought it would be an influenza pandemic. But this time it turned out to be coronavirus. So the world was more prepared for an influenza pandemic because those are the pandemics we've had in the past. The second thing is we knew that it would most likely be a virus and that it would be a zoonotic infection, because we know that the majority of viruses that jump from animals to humans, which have occurred in the past century, many of them have actually a predilection for becoming an epidemic or a pandemic virus. So the human-animal interactions, and again, it's very interesting looking back at the history. Even if you look at HIV and at Ebola, these all came, the Nipah virus, many of the viruses that are quite deadly in humans, they infect animals and they don't kill those animals. A lot of them come from bats, for example. So this virus has been obviously in some animals. It has a very close similarity to bat coronaviruses. We don't know how it moved from bat to humans, whether it came directly or through an intermediate animal, and whether that animal was a wild animal or a domesticated animal. These are things we still don't know. But whatever it is, it made the jump. And we don't know when that jump happened also from animal to human, and whether the virus has been actually slowly evolving in humans for some time. So these are the studies which still need to be done. But it's clear now that this virus is able to transmit very easily between human beings. And luckily for us, it has less of a fatality rate than either MERS or SARS. As we know, MERS has the highest fatality of around 30% of people who get the infection end up dying. And in SARS, it was about 10%. MERS continues to show up from time to time, mostly in the Middle East. And SARS was luckily, I think, completely contained at that time in 2004, hasn't come back since then. But this is a virus that's very closely related to the SARS coronavirus 1, which is why it's now called SARS coronavirus 2 by the virologists.
So will this also, is there a chance, or what is the chance that one day this will also disappear as a global threat like the MERS virus or the original SARS virus?
It could take a couple of different trajectories. Early in the outbreak, WHO kept the pressure up for countries to contain it, hoping that like SARS, it could have been contained and finished off within a few months. It looks now like it's spread, globally, it's spread in most countries. It has already entered into a substantial proportion of the, it's spread so widely that we can't say with confidence that we can contain it. So what can happen? It could become a seasonal virus like influenza virus. It could have waves, coming down and then coming up again once or twice a year. You could see these waves happening in different parts of the world. Or it could also become an endemic infection in the sense that you end up with the virus causing disease in humans at a low level, perhaps at a manageable level, depending on how we handle it. And then it continues, people continue to get sick. But we learn to live with it, the virus learns to live with it. And then over a period of few years, we don't know what will happen. The virus may end up becoming less virulent, or enough of the population develops antibodies, either naturally or through a vaccine. And then the virus stops really producing the kind of outbreaks that we've seen this year. This year, the whole world was seeing this virus for the first time. So human beings do not have pre-existing immunity, which is why it just came in and swept populations, creating this kind of panic. Over time, again, as I said, either naturally or through vaccine, as immunity builds up, it may not be so catastrophic. But for the next year or two, we should expect to see this virus continue to cause disease.
So why have the European countries and America been so badly hit with such high fatalities? That is Britain, Italy, Spain, and the US.
Well, I think there are a few reasons we could postulate why this, and it's probably a combination of reasons. I don't think it's just one reason. One is that, of course, there's high travel. Most of these areas that have been badly affected have a lot of international travel, and a lot of people with infection could have traveled to these areas and sort of seeded the communities there. Secondly, we've seen that the profile of people who've come into the hospital has been mostly the ones who got really sick are the elderly. And as you know, these countries have a long life expectancy. In fact, the average age of the people who passed away in Italy, sadly, was 81 years. And similarly, it's been the same in the other European countries. So I think for the older people in the community, especially those who have other illnesses, this virus was able to really make them very sick. And I think the third reason is that countries did not take it seriously at the beginning. And I must say that the WHO has been warning all countries, high income, low income, middle income, saying this is not something to take lightly. Put in place the mechanisms, get the labs set up, the testing kits set up, the public health machinery to be able to detect and isolate and quarantine and track contacts and so on. In many of these countries, that was not really done. Different elements of this did not work as well. And so they were suddenly overtaken by events when the number of cases was so huge that the health system, the hospitals could not cope. But we've also seen other countries that took the right steps, that put in place the measures, the public health measures, and that were able to contain and control with very little mortality. And if you see this, mostly the Southeast Asian countries that have done that. And people say it's because of the past experience of having been through SARS that countries like Hong Kong and others in Singapore and so on, are so prepared, and the population knows how to handle a virus like this. So I think it's a combination of both the governments and the public knowing how to handle viral outbreaks like this, and also in some parts of the world, the public health infrastructure, unfortunately, has crumbled. And I think this shows us very, very clearly again why the basic principles of public health are so important. Doesn't matter what the income level of the country.
So in this ranking of countries that have handled it well in terms of getting prepared early enough and countries that took their eye off the ball, where would you place India?
I would say that India was one of the countries that took it really seriously right from the beginning. In fact, last week we had a meeting here where once a month or so we have all the health ministers of the 194 member states joining in for a discussion on COVID-19. And there were 6 presentations from each of the regions. The Health Minister of India, Dr. Harshvardhan, presented the timelines, and it was quite incredible. In fact, he said 17th of January was the first meeting that was held at a high level. All of these different committees were set up. On the 30th of January, the same day WHO declared a public health emergency, was when the first case was found, which means that already states and cities had put in place screening of travelers, initially, of course, from China. So that is how the first few students who came back from Wuhan were detected in, and I believe the first 3 cases were in Kerala. And then I've heard firsthand from people who were traveling how they were called up by the health authorities. And this is in different states. So it obviously worked in most parts, where they were actually tracked. If they had come back on a flight from abroad, they were called every day for the next 14 days to ask how they were and if they had fever and so on. So I think those elements were put in place, and I think we were able to limit and contain the number of infections that actually went into the community. But these screenings have limitations. They are not sensitive. Temperature screening, we know, is not sensitive, and therefore a few people with infection would have slipped in, and I think a lot of people who came back from Europe were the ones who brought the later waves of infection in March, actually, late February and March. And then they traveled, and then there were too many contacts and so on. So that is how it actually got in. But I think it was reduced by the actions that were taken. And that is why I think India has been able to keep that line fairly flat and has not seen the exponential growth that
So
other countries.
Does WHO trust the data that government of India is putting out of testing, of positives, of fatalities?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think WHO does trust the data that we get from countries worldwide. We rely on countries to give us the data. Now, many countries have more or less developed systems to collect health information. So, in fact, even before all of this happened, the COVID, one of our priorities from WHO was how do we strengthen countries' health information systems? And I'm talking a lot of countries in Africa, a lot of countries in Asia, where we get the basic data, of course, but there could be so much more data that could be collected that would be really useful for the planners within those countries, and of course for WHO to monitor the health of the world. So overall, I would say that there is still a scope for a lot of improvement in our health information systems.
You don't see fudging in Indian data. No. Is fudging possible in a country like India?
I don't think so, because it's a democracy, and things are open. Things can be scrutinized. People criticize. Everybody has a voice. So it is very difficult to hide anything.
And you were heading ICMR institutionally. You think ICMR as an institution will fudge or hide?
Never. No. Never. I think ICMR really believes in science, and I don't think I've ever come across any incident where they would have fudge or hide data. Sometimes, as I said, it's not there. The quality is poor, or there are not enough labs. There isn't enough capacity. That could be there, but I don't think there would be any willful hiding of data.
So I'll tell you where the doubts come from. The doubts come from what happened in China just now, that suddenly overnight they upped their numbers in Wuhan exactly by 50%. That sounded, people, I mean, these estimates don't change in such round figures overnight. So then you think that, look, if the Chinese are getting away with all this, then who knows what's happening wherever.
I was discussing these mortality statistics with some colleagues in India also. And when I was in the ICMR, one of the things that I was really keen on strengthening, and I don't think I succeeded, was the cause of death reporting. In India, 2/3 of people actually die at home, and we don't know what they died of. And even the third of people who die in hospitals, if you look at the way the cause of deaths are recorded, it just says cardiac arrest, heart attack, doesn't tell you anything. This is a weakness, because not just because of COVID, but because this is the way that you get to know the burden of disease it's called vital statistics. And in developed countries, they depend a lot on knowing the exact cause of death, which is got a coding that the WHO puts out. It's a global coding system called the International Classification of Disease, the ICD system, and it standardizes and it tells you what you have and what's going up, what's going down, etc. This is an area we need to really strengthen. But in terms of the death reports from China, I think what had happened is that they have now looked at all the deaths that happened in Wuhan during that time, and they've been able to reclassify, because the outbreak, when it's happening, it's very difficult to keep up with the statistics. If you see what's happened in the UK and in some of the other European countries, they're finding now that people who are dying in care homes are dying of COVID, but not being counted as COVID deaths. So the chief medical officer of the UK also said that we'll need to match up with our statistics that come from the national statistics system, and we'll have to add them to the NHS data to get the true picture of the COVID deaths. So I think all countries at some point are going to have to reconcile the statistics they get from different sources and come up with a more accurate number of deaths.
So right now you trust China's figures as well?
Yes, just like we trust every other country's figures.
Yeah.
What the government provides to us, we accept.
So President Trump keeps on saying that many more people have died in China, many more people have got infected. And I know that President Trump has been attacking WHO. So you please tell us, President Trump ko gussa kyun aata hai? Why does he get so angry with WHO? But also, if you see statements made by Secretary of State Pompeo, those are more specific about China not sharing all the data of research on the virus and what he calls as WHO's inability to get it from China, and thereby to get China to fulfill its obligations under international health regulations.
So there are two aspects to this question, and I think it's important for people to also understand what WHO can and cannot do. The WHO, is a member state organization, and in fact, we are the secretariat here, and we serve the member states, the 194 member states. They govern the WHO, and they meet during the World Health Assembly. There's an executive board that takes all the decisions. We follow the instructions given by the member states. The member states have the authority. We don't have the authority. Member states have the authority to make the rules and regulations. In 2005, they made a set of regulations called the International Health Regulations. And this was done in response to SARS and so on, and was done in order to protect the world from exactly what we are seeing now. And so all member states agreed that they would share data according to the International Health Regulations. I think to a large extent it's been very good, very successful, but it doesn't give powers to WHO to take action. So WHO has to work through cooperation, through building consensus, through giving advice, through persuasion. It's not a body with an inspectorate function which can march into countries and do inspections and things like that. We don't have the powers to do that. As far as China is concerned, I gave you the timelines, of what had happened on the 31st of December. They informed us.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah, sure.
Since you're talking about China, now there are a few dates. Middle of January, WHO have put out a tweet saying there is no evidence of human-to-human transmission. Then third week of January, Dr. Tedros is in China, where no great concern is expressed. In fact, there is appreciation of the Chinese response. Then the 31st, when America stops flights from China, then there is actually criticism of America. So when Dr. Tedros says that America or Donald Trump are politicizing the pandemic, there is a counter that probably didn't he politicize the pandemic to begin with?
Not at all. So again, the Director General goes on the advice of the technical experts, of the scientists, the experts, not only those who work in WHO, but we rely on networks of experts from around the world, from many different countries. In fact, the emergency committee is made up of experts, 16 experts from different countries. They debate and decide when something is an emergency or not. And the Director General, of course, then accepts, or he can also reject their recommendations, but the Director General generally accepts the recommendations of the committees. On the 14th of January, our technical expert said in her briefing that it was very possible that there is human-to-human transmission, though we don't have definitive evidence of that. But knowing coronaviruses, knowing how other diseases have spread, we have to be very careful. And she explained what it means of droplet transmission, etc., etc. And then our technical guidance also followed. As far as travel and trade are concerned, again, this is part of our international health regulations, which talks about travel and trade should not be restricted even when an emergency is declared, because it leads to so many other unintended consequences. And therefore, what WHO recommends to countries is don't restrict travel and trade, but in case you do put in place some restrictions, they should be temporary, they should be measured, and there should be a good reason for doing that. And what we do is we sort of track what different countries are doing and why they're doing it. Again, it's a question of WHO putting out guidance based on either certain rules which have been developed or the best possible evidence which is available. And we update and change from time to time based on the new evidence that's coming in.
We'll bring questions from our very curious audience, but let me just stick with this for a minute. So countries that stopped travel from China early, America, India, in retrospect, America was criticized. In retrospect, do you think they did the right thing or not?
What we know about these viruses is that stopping travel doesn't stop the spread of infection. It's possible that for a short period of time, these things could either slow it down. Modelers from around the world said that at that time, right at the beginning, in January itself, the modelers who were putting out models said it can delay, it will stop travel, because in today's world, you're not going to stop travel forever. So if you stop travel for a month, 2 months, it can delay the virus coming in, but it will no longer be able to stop it. And then we see that in the US, actually, the huge wave of infection that occurred on the East Coast in New York was actually travel from Europe and not from China. So it is something that, countries decide.
Wait, people brought it from China to Europe and Europe to America to begin with.
Yes, of course, because infection started in China, yes.
Yeah. So now questions from many of our viewers and participants. So let me get the question that I think everybody is asking out of the way. So this is the credit for this goes to Mukul Burma, who says, when can the world expect a genuine vaccination? Because you are monitoring everything. I see your website. Now there's almost 100 vaccination projects listed there.
That's right. So we have, yes, over 100 vaccine candidates. We have been tracking it. As I said, we started on the 10th of January with the scientists.
When the sequence of the virus was unraveled first.
Sequence of the virus, the next day, scientists started creating candidates. Now, if you see what's happened, it's quite unprecedented. I don't think there's ever been a situation where within 3 months of a new pathogen being uncovered or described, that there are so many vaccine candidates that have come up, including many in India. And 7 of them are now in clinical trials, in the first phase of human clinical trials. We hope, what WHO hopes to do, is to help scientists from around the world, as well as private sector, the manufacturers, the developers, the academics, to really come together and have open and frank discussions about the different vaccines that are being developed, and come up with a prioritization on which vaccines and what are the criteria. So those are the kind of background work we are doing now. One is tracking the candidates. Second is developing target product profiles. What kind of vaccine do we want to see for this infection? Third is to developing the draft clinical trial protocols for how such a trial could be run. Very important also, the work that we've done in the last 2 months, again with scientists from around the world, is developing animal models to test these vaccines before they can go into large-scale human trials, because the safety of any new vaccine is very, very important. And then standardizing assays, standardizing endpoints. So I think we're in a good place now. And you may have noticed yesterday, the Director General launched a big program called ACT. This is Access to COVID Tools Accelerator. So ACT Accelerator is calling on governments, on private sector, public sector, scientists, developers, etc., to come together and get a vaccine in the shortest possible time. If we're very, very lucky and if everything works well, we could be there in 9 to 12 months, but it would be an unprecedented scientific achievement if that was to happen. The more traditional, it takes up to 5 years or 10 years to develop a vaccine, but we're hoping this will be done in 12 to 18 months, if not less.
So there is a group in UK that's saying even as early as this fall. You take it seriously?
Well, they have launched their human trial, which is going to be injecting 500 people. But then they have to wait to see how many of them actually get infection, because you have to prove the efficacy of the vaccine before you say that it can be used. So efficacy and safety, these are the two critical considerations. And the scientist who was describing this from Oxford, Dr. Andrew Pollack, was saying that, it's also a matter of luck. We don't know how many of these individuals will actually come down with the infection. So you always have two groups. You have a control group, you have the vaccinated group, and then enough people must get infected in both the groups to be able to compare and see if there's a difference. So it's very hard to predict. I think they're also hoping, if they're very lucky, they will finish this by September, but it could be longer. But there are other candidates also which will be going into phase 2 and so on through the summer. I think we will see a lot of activity.
So what about a therapy meanwhile?
So in terms of therapy, it's very challenging. Antivirals are difficult. But again, so what's happened is that at the beginning, the easiest thing to do is to look for existing drugs which have already been used in humans, which are known to be safe for some other indication, some other disease, and see if those are effective against this. So that's what people started doing, started screening a large number of drugs to see if there is some activity. Came up with a few, like lopinavir, ritonavir, which is an anti-HIV drug, which acts on the protease enzyme. They came up with remdesivir, it's a broad spectrum antiviral, was originally developed for hepatitis, then tried for Ebola, was not very good, successful in that, now being tried for COVID. And then hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine, which again, there was some reports in the lab that it had some activity in suppressing the viral replication. So these were the initial drugs that have gone into clinical trials.
I have a lot of questions from HCQ. HCQ is everybody's favorite brand. It's also become so politicized now. So I have three of my colleagues, that's our science editor Sandhya Ramesh and Swagata Yadavar, who covers health, and also Mohana Basu, all asking questions about HCQ.
So we can come to HCQ. So the trials that are going on now are basically what we call these repurposed drugs. And we still don't have results from any of the big trials. What we have is from China, where also they did a large number of trials. I must say that Chinese scientists were able to do all of these studies despite the huge clinical load they had. But they were relatively small studies, inconclusive studies. So now we're waiting for the bigger trials, including the Solidarity trial, to give us the results. But meanwhile, there are people also working on other drugs and monoclonal antibodies, which are likely to be effective, but again, they need to also go through the phases of trials. As far as hydroxychloroquine is concerned, it's had a long history of being proposed as an antiviral drug, even for influenza. It was tried. Yes, it's been tried for many viral infections because in the lab, it seems to have activity against viruses in the culture. But when you translate that into human beings, it has never been found to be protective against any other virus. And so here again, even the scientists who were advising us on the Solidarity trial were initially not very convinced that hydroxychloroquine should be tested. But then there was some early studies, some case series that were coming out of China, which showed that there could be some benefit in reducing the severity of the disease. And so that is why it's been included in the Solidarity trial. So we have to wait for the results. There are other trials which are looking at the preventive effect of hydroxychloroquine when it's given to healthcare workers or other high-risk populations. So both for treatment and for prevention, trials are going on, and only trials will give us the answer.
So do you agree with ICMR's recommendation to health workers and high-risk people to take hydroxychloroquine as a prophylactic?
My personal feeling, and also what WHO says, is that it's better to test it in a research setting, because we really don't have the evidence that it provides any protection. And so there's no harm in saying that we want to protect our healthcare workers, but do it in a setting where you can actually collect the data and make an informed decision at the end of a few months of whether it's worth continuing or not. Meanwhile, I mean, there are global trials going on, so I think the answer will come.
So you don't see this as a reckless idea?
Well, it's a relatively safe drug. It's been used for many, many years for malaria initially, but then for a lot of autoimmune diseases. So in the doses in which it's being used for prophylaxis, it should be safe generally. And so I wouldn't say it's reckless. It's just that we don't know if it's having any protection, and it should not lead to a complacency.
Right.
Because you're taking hydroxychloroquine, you're protected, and you can be careless with other things. I think the personal protective equipment and the other precautions are absolutely critical.
And this other thing, remdesivir, which we noticed that it's part of your Solidarity trials also, in Indian labs and centers will also be involved.
Yes, so very happy that India has joined Solidarity trial. In fact, I think the first few patients were randomized just over the last couple of days.
From India?
From India, yes.
Oh, I see.
And we now have over 10 countries that have already started enrolling patients. Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, India, Iran has actually enrolled the largest number. And then in Europe, we have France, we have Switzerland, Italy, Spain, and a few more, Norway, and Canada. So we have a large number of countries from Africa just waiting to join, hopefully very soon. Remdesivir was included because, as I said, it's a broad spectrum antiviral, and it acts against the polymerase enzyme of the virus. It's RNA polymerase. And so,
which is the operative enzyme in case of COVID-19.
Exactly, the enzyme that is needed for viral replication. And so we're very happy that we were able to work with all of these different drug companies and get them to give us their drugs for this trial. It's a large trial for maybe 10,000 people or more.
Yes.
It's what's called an adaptive design, which
Right.
means it can add more arms to it. So tomorrow, if there's a promising new drug, we can actually add another arm to test that also. And one arm is always standard of care. Whatever is the standard of care in the country, that will be there, and that's the control against which we will compare.
So I have a question from Professor B.R. Mehta, Special Advisor and former trustee of Dorabji Tata Trust. You might know him. He says a recent study by US government has indicated that sun rays and higher temperature can kill exposed COVID-19 virus quite quickly. Do you take that study? I think it's a Homeland Department study. Do you take that seriously?
Yes, so sunlight does kill germs, bacteria, viruses, but you have to be exposed for quite some time. So you have to be out in a bright sunlight. You have to put the whatever has that virus on it. If it's exposed for 2 to 3 hours, then the virus could be, if not killed, it could be, quite a bit damaged. But there is no evidence that the kind of heat that we get in India or the humidity is going to actually result in a diminution of
the virus.
Of the virus. No, there is no such evidence, and we have seen in other tropical climate countries of Southeast Asia that the virus has been able to spread. And so I think, again, relying on the weather to control the epidemic would not be the wise thing to do. There was also talk about the UV radiation as
right.
being, and yes, and there are many kinds of UV rays, the UVA and B, which actually come from sunlight, which are also used for treatment of skin diseases. But UVC is the one that's very powerful in disinfection. And it's used sometimes in hospitals and other settings to actually disinfect rooms. But it's very dangerous also for human beings. And so we have to distinguish between using ultraviolet to disinfect equipments or surfaces or rooms or operation theaters and using it casually in a household where you may get exposed. So people should know that, and also there are machines available on the market which say they're UV and so on. You have to be very careful as to exactly what is it, what kind of UV rays is it giving out, and how it should be used. It's not
everything that disinfects surfaces doesn't disinfect the body from inside. Particularly, don't try to drink disinfectants or inject them into your body.
That's dangerous.
That's just dangerous, or that's one thing that will surely work, except to kill you.
So obviously, I think soap kills the virus. It gets rid of the viral outer coating, the lipid coating, and therefore soap is the simplest. And then, of course, alcohol, 70% alcohol. And those are things which we should be using to clean our hands, external part of the body as well as surfaces. And I think when we get back to work after the lockdown, this is quite a useful thing to do, particularly for surfaces in areas which are commonly touched by people, because that's where you touch. If you're carrying the virus, you may leave it on a doorknob or on a lift button, and somebody who comes along and touches it and then touches their face may transmit it. And so I think as offices reopen, as buildings reopen, and so on, we need to put in place some of these measures which will reduce the risk of transmission from person to person. And then, of course, including the other things like hand washing and wearing of masks when you're in crowded places.
Yeah, and also fever checks. I think the fever check thermometer will now become the new metal detector.
Yes, fever checks are useful, but again, you can miss people, but definitely
they're not
something.
Conclusive.
Yeah, they're not.
So I have a question from Kriti, who again asks a question that everybody has, because all of us are frightened. She says, can this virus spread through an airborne method? Can you sniff it from the air?
Yeah, I think it's very important to clarify about this. So when we say it's a droplet infection, what we mean is that when you cough or sneeze or even speak, especially speaking forcefully or breathing heavily, during this time, there are droplets that are coming out of different sizes that come out of your airways, and they fall to the ground in front of you, and generally they fall within a few feet of you. They may remain suspended in the air for a couple of minutes, but they settle down and with the dust particles. If you're standing very close to a person or sitting very close to a person, then these droplets could actually come directly onto you as well. So this is actually called, it is droplet transmission. When we talk about aerosol, that means very fine small particles which can stay in the air for a long time and which you can breathe it in. That happens when you are doing procedures and things like that. And so that's
where you say they are aerosolized in a closed environment.
Aerosolized in a closed environment, when you're intubating a patient and giving oxygen and there's high flow oxygen going in, the particles can get aerosolized and be in the atmosphere. So this is a risk for healthcare workers and when you're doing procedures for the patient. But for ordinary people, it's a droplet, and the droplet can come directly onto you if you're very close to a person. But most of the time, the droplets come onto the hands or fall onto what we call fomites, which are objects, and then somebody else touches them, and then you transmit it to yourself, and that's how it spreads. So the logic of wearing cloth masks, which many countries, including India, are now recommending for people, is that it prevents these droplets from actually coming out. So if you're in a crowded bus, if you're in a crowded shop or a train, and you cannot physically distance, then the possibility is that even during ordinary speech or when you cough, you may throw out these droplets.
But
and so
if you're walking on a street which is not very crowded or in a park, you don't have to worry about the air.
Yes, you don't have to worry about the air, absolutely not. And if you're far away from people, you don't have to worry about transmission either. So the mask is really to protect people who are in very close contact.
So, in fact, you've answered the question already that Siddharth Junjunwala is asking that if we are to live with this virus for the next many years, what kind of lifestyle changes will it bring about? And you said that we'll be much more hygienically oriented. People will clean doorknobs, maybe sanitizers, maybe even masks, just as they do in Southeast Asian countries a little bit. Now, this new survey data in New York that New York Governor Andrew Cuomo revealed yesterday, it shows that it's quite a scientific survey that more than 20% of adults in New York City have been infected at some point. Does that show that no matter how much we fight this virus, it will keep infecting people and we'll never catch those who are asymptomatic?
Yes, so what these antibody tests show is that you've been exposed to the virus and developed antibodies. And as you said, Shekhar, in New York City, they found 20% of these randomly selected people had the antibody. In the state as a whole, when they looked, it was 13%. At the same time, Santa Clara County in California, which had reported the first few cases, also did a random survey, and they found only 2.5% of the population had antibodies. Now, New York's had a really explosive outbreak, and despite that, you have 20% of the population, I think one of the highest actually, because what we've seen from Germany and some of the other countries like Italy, they've been much less percentage, which means a large proportion of the population is still susceptible to this virus. And so it's going to continue to spread till enough people acquire it naturally or they get protected through a vaccine. And what it means is that we have to continue all of these measures that we are now talking, not these extreme so-called lockdowns, but whatever measures now are being put in place will have to be sustained for a period of time. We'll have to treat COVID as yet another pathogen which is going to affect humans. And I think we'll have to come down now from the state of panic that everybody seems to be in into a more moderated and a more balanced approach to tackling this virus, where we have to balance the needs of our day-to-day lives, of the economy, of being able to go to work, of children to be able to go to school, and most importantly, of all the other health problems that we have, which at the moment have been put on the back burner,
Right.
and health systems have been focusing only on this. That can't go on for too long, because people die of tuberculosis, and they die of high blood pressure, and they die of heart attacks, and we need to be able to provide those health services at the same time being able to manage this. So we have to now learn how to manage it as we manage so many other health problems in our.
So many questions. I will round them off from my colleagues as well as from many of our participants. One from Choco Veliappa. So the question is essentially that do you agree with the hypothesis that Indian subcontinent is an outlier on the good side, which means 22% of the world's population has less than 2% of the cases and even less than 2% of the deaths. So, is there something in the subcontinent, whether BCG vaccinations, uh, epigenetics, genetics, whatever it's called, or is it just that we are probably 3 weeks behind the Western world?
There are many hypotheses, of course, for this, that why India and the neighboring countries have had relatively less impact so far. And I think, again, it's a combination of things. I doubt if it's any one. We have a younger population. I think there's a big difference in the age structure of the population. So even if this infection had been spreading, we know that in most cases, it's very, very mild illness, and people don't even think twice about it. It's just like a cold, and you get over it like a flu. And so it may be not the same severity as what you see in Europe, where you have a very large proportion of the elderly. The second is that the international travel, compared to some of the countries in Europe and in India, of course, it's less, the proportion of people who are traveling abroad and who might have brought the infection in. So the seeding of infection also could have been less. And then I think what is also very important to mention is that the measures were taken, action was taken. India did take WHO's advice and the advisories that were being put out seriously. Health system was geared up, the whole of government got geared up, they took action, and that has also helped to keep it low. Now, it could at any time start going up again, and it's particularly worrying if that happens in crowded places like urban slums. And so we must, I think for India, but also many countries in Africa, really need to think about how do you handle this, because we live in a different environment than Europe. Social distancing in Europe is very different than physical distancing in countries of the developing world, where you live in overcrowded cities. And so I think a new approach, a different approach, a more balanced approach could be actually pioneered by India and many of the countries in Africa, where you put in place public health measures which are sensible. And I think community participation is very critical and very key. I was looking back at all the other public health successes that have been possible in India, whether it was a control of HIV/AIDS or polio eradication, was only possible through, yes, smallpox. It was only possible because the communities understood and they cooperated and they participated.
So you don't take BCG very seriously. BCG deals with your favorite bug of all time. You spent your lifetime researching the tuberculosis bug.
BCG is an interesting vaccine, because of its non-specific effects on the innate immune system. It's been known for a long time. And in fact, oral polio vaccine has also been shown to have a boosting effect on innate immunity. But BCG is given for newborns in India and many parts of the world. And we know that even its protective effect against TB wanes off within the first few years. So to imagine that it will have a protective immunity on other bugs which last into adulthood doesn't seem very likely. If you gave a revaccination with BCG and boosted up the innate immunity again in adult life, perhaps it could have some protective effects. It's impossible to say whether it would have a significant impact on COVID unless, again, trials are done. And I'm happy that some trials are now underway for
In
BCG.
Pune, I think trials are being done right now.
Yes, so there's the VPM, which is a recombinant BCG, which is made by the Serum Institute. I think that's being trialed, but also there's a trial in Australia and I believe one in the Netherlands as well. So again, we should know over a period of time whether.
So why? I have Dr. Devina Bajpai asking a question, but again, many others are asking this question. I mean, we are not complaining. Sometimes when statistics work for you, when low statistics work for you, you should take them. But why is the mortality rate low in India? Nobody's complaining.
I think it's again related to the demographics of the patient, of the people who have been found to have infection. But I must say that within India, there are differences in the different states, and I have not analyzed the mortality data from India in detail, so I cannot comment. But there are differences in states, both in the number of cases and in mortality rates. And I think probably the scientists in India should analyze that and see whether it's due to just age and comorbidities or it's due to other factors as well in terms of how well they were managed. One thing about this illness is when people deteriorate, they do so very rapidly.
Very rapidly.
Very rapidly, and therefore the systems all have to be geared up. And you can have kidney failure, you of course can have lung failure, acute respiratory distress syndrome. It can also cause strokes and things like that. And so you really have to be prepared to handle a variety of complications that can push people into very severe illness. And so luckily it's a small proportion of people who need it, but they do need critical care facilities.
And that's because your immune system becomes so angry in some cases.
Yes. So it's what they call a cytokine storm, where the immune system just overproduces cytokines. But again, I should say this is something I think we still haven't fully understood as to what is the pathophysiology that causes lung damage in people with COVID-19. Doctors who have treated these patients in the ICUs have said it is unlike the other causes of acute respiratory distress syndrome, and therefore the management also may be different. And in fact, they started describing different patterns and people who respond better to oxygen rather than to ventilation.
Yes.
So I think when it's the doctors who are treating these patients who have to now, and we keep on updating our clinical management guidance as we get more information.
So has your guidance changed from ventilators to oxygen?
No, this is again a judgment call, which only the doctors and the experienced physicians can make. And in fact, they're all learning from each other. So the first sets of learning came from China. The second big sets of learning came from Italy. And now we're getting from New York. And so we're seeing doctors describing these patterns. But one thing they do say is two types of patients. One who have low levels of oxygen, but who are very comfortable. They're not having any respiratory distress. And that group should not be ventilated early. And another group which comes into the hospital with a lot of respiratory distress, also with low oxygenation, who needs to be put on ventilation, who needs to be put on prone position. So you put the person face down. And then of course, it's been seen that it takes a long time. It takes 2 to 3 weeks once a person is on a ventilator to either recover or, unfortunately die.
Yeah, in fact, the research that's come out of New York hospital system in JAMA yesterday, that is Journal of American Medical Association, it shows that 88.1% patients put on the ventilator in those hospitals did not make it. So
yes, it's very complex and you need all kinds of then supportive care. So this is why I feel again, for lower resourced countries, it's better to invest in prevention and better to invest at levels of the health facility where you can treat people early, you can give them oxygen and other supportive care. I hope that some drug will be found to be effective, so that will reduce the incidence, because once you're in critical care on the ventilator, as you said, even in the best equipped hospitals, the mortality is high. So we have to prevent people from getting into that state.
So I have a question from a woman, Nalini Saligram, about men. And she's asking, why is it so that COVID seems to kill men a lot more than women?
That's again a good question, and it's probably linked to the underlying other illnesses, what we call comorbidities. In most of the descriptions of the patients who've had severe illness, majority of them have had hypertension or with or without diabetes, cardiovascular disease, or underlying chronic respiratory disease. And these diseases are more common in men. And that could be one reason. There could be other biological reasons also. In fact, in New York, their experience has been that obesity has been a risk factor, and the African American population and the Hispanic population has been
a higher incidence of
incidence, partly because of obesity and all of these other hypertension and diabetes, but partly also because of lack of access to healthcare in general.
But very often, diabetes and hypertension and cardiovascular disease come along with obesity.
Yes, yes, exactly. They all go hand in hand, and so it's difficult to separate the causation of one from the other.
Smoking?
Smoking is a risk factor for all respiratory diseases. It increases the severity of the disease and also the likely possibility of death. And we described that for tuberculosis a long time ago, that smoking increases the risk chances of death by at least 3 or 4 times if you get TB versus being a non-smoker. So smoking is definitely a no-no.
In fact, our mutual friend Kiran Mazumdar Shaw said that of the deaths in Karnataka, almost all are men and almost all are heavy smokers, were heavy smokers.
Right.
So if we talk about obesity, now the thing about statistics is sometimes absolutes work for you, sometimes percentages work for you. Sometimes, but often one works against you. It's rare that both work for you. Now, if we look at India being a young country, true, only 10% of India is over 60 years of age. That's beautiful. But 10% of India is more than twice the population of Italy. So percentages work for us, absolutes don't work for us. So where do we hide 13 crore people?
Yes, of course, the challenge of numbers for countries like India is always, for anything you want to do, the first challenge is how do you reach everybody and how do you, in this case, protect the elderly. I think we have to be pragmatic and we know what works. We know what works in terms of how you can prevent the transmission of this infection from one person to the other. And so you have to be extra careful around the elderly. Once you know the mode of transmission, so anybody who's sick in the family should really self-isolate and not, go with close to an elderly person. Again, there are a lot of practical challenges when we talk about people living within small households or in overcrowded settings. And this is where wearing a mask and hand washing, etc., can actually come in quite useful. But as the lockdowns are lifted and people go back to work, the older people and those with underlying illnesses perhaps may take, as a next step, or they may have to take a little more care.
So I have Parag Doshi asking the question about the conspiracy theory that a lot of people believe. It's a very popular conspiracy theory. Was this virus created in a lab in China?
Absolutely not. And this is based on the detailed study of the virus genome sequence, of which now there are, by the way, more than 12,000 sequences. The earliest ones came from China, and then people from all over the world. I'm very happy to see a large number of Indian virus genetic sequences in this global database called GISAID. And scientists from around the world actually looked at this question. Very early on, these conspiracy theories had been floated and said that if this had been a genetically engineered virus in the lab, there would be a particular marker that would have been very difficult to hide. So they also found that this particular virus was very closely linked genetically, we could link it to a natural bat coronavirus. And also, it's quite close to the original SARS virus. And so, I think, I know that these conspiracy theories keep on circulating, especially in social media, but ask any scientist who's an expert in evolutionary biology, in virology, in genetics, they will say that knowing the sequence of the virus now and what we know about it, it is impossible that it was created in a lab. So I think we should put an end now to these conspiracy theories. What we still don't know is, as I said, the animal, how it jumped from bat to animal, which animal, and then to humans.
So you are not sure of the pangolin being the usual suspect in this case?
We're not sure about that. No.
Not sure.
So that needs more research.
That's a likelihood.
It could be a pangolin, could be some other animal in the middle between a bat and a human.
So then the other question, wet markets and the idea that you can sell wild animals live and eat them. Do you think that sort of use by date on this idea is now over, that these cultural differences should now go because it's so dangerous?
Yes, exactly. And I think that's very clear that, you know, having in the same market wild animals, other kinds of animals, that too when they're alive, leads to a lot of mixing of these viruses and can generate these recombinant viruses and so on, and increase the chances of a jump into humans. So WHO's guidance about these markets is quite clear, and it says that these markets that are selling meat, etc., should follow the food safety standards that have been set out, and certainly we discourage wild animals being sold in any of these markets.
So will that be the advice to China now to try and stop the wild animals trade?
Yes.
Yes, and wet markets also.
No, wet markets, the meat markets, of course, will
That's
exist.
okay, but not with wild animals there.
Not with wild animals, exactly, and following the food safety standards which are supposed to be followed in these markets.
That's right.
Because we recognize that, you know, food security is important, so we don't ban these meat markets as a whole, but there are guidelines which need to be followed, and yes, wild animals definitely not.
But this question of rearing bears or rearing wild snakes, rearing genuinely wild animals, bats are only one of those, pangolins, which are also protected. Do you think time has now come for global sort of pressure, persuasion, or pleading, whatever you might call it, with China to say, please protect us from this?
Yes, I think there are, you know, rules and regulations about wildlife trade and so on, and a lot of what was happening was illegal trade in this wildlife. So certainly, I think everybody agrees that that should not happen. It's not good for biodiversity. It's not good for human health.
So coming back to where the Americans were, Secretary Pompeo said that China is not sharing all the information that it should as per its obligations under international health regulations. Do you buy that?
We have not come across any specific interest area or question where China has not been willing to share. You know, there was a big international team that went to China in February. The Director General first visited at the end of January, and then a team went, which was headed by a WHO expert, but which had experts from all over the world, in fact, Africa, Asia, and 2 scientists from the US, one from the US CDC and one from the US NIH. They went, they traveled, they met all the Chinese researchers and scientists and experts from the National Health Commission. They got a huge amount of data. They also went to Wuhan, the epicenter, to see for themselves how things were being tackled there. And they produced a report at the end of it, which described their observations and made some recommendations. And from time to time, you know, China has in fact been sharing their experiences with people from all over the world. So not just with or through WHO, but there have been a large number of countries. I have heard from experts that they have these bilateral dialogues, they have webinars with Chinese doctors, with Chinese CDC experts, because to learn from their experiences. And similarly, other countries like South Korea, like Hong Kong, Singapore, Vietnam, they've all been quite forthcoming with their own experiences. So I think there's been a lot of learning and a lot of openness on the parts of the Chinese authorities to really share information, both on the clinical side, but also on the public health side.
Well, you are a scientist, which none of us is. When you look at stuff coming out of China, is there anything that makes you suspicious that they could be hiding something?
As of now, I have not seen anything which makes me or any of my colleagues suspicious. As I said, they've been extremely open to discussions and dialogues, and we speak to them on a regular basis. They're part of many of our committees. They're going to work with us now on vaccine development. They have 2 candidate vaccines in human clinical trials. So they've been extremely collaborative in their approach. And I think it's not just China. We've seen huge amounts of global collaboration, including with the United States. You know, United States is one of our most valued partners in terms of not just resources, but in terms of the technical collaboration we have with their institutes. They are some of the best scientific institutes and people globally. And it's been a strong bond over the years. And I hope that that's going to continue. And this is a temporary problem that we can get over with them.
So why is President Trump so angry?
I cannot answer that question, but I think at the level of the scientists, I think our collaborations have always been excellent. We work very closely together with both the CDC and the NIH, both in terms of our guidance, technical guidance, and in terms of our approaches. As I said, they were part of the delegation that went to China. And so I think that there's the element of the administration wanting to review and look at the way that WHO operates. So one other thing I'd like to say is that WHO is very open and transparent to having a review. And in fact, the Director General has said, yes, we will welcome a complete audit of everything that has happened, both in WHO
functioning and performance.
Function, where it fell short, where it could have done better. And in fact, that's an opportunity to strengthen the organization. The same thing happened at the time of Ebola. The same thing should happen now. But the timing right now is not right, because we're really fighting a wildfire. And we need to be focusing on controlling that. And the time will come for the audit and the learnings.
I've taken a lot of your time, but I just have 2 questions, and then I'll ask one of mine to wind up, because these are questions that everybody wants to ask. One, does Ayurveda help with coronavirus?
It's the same answer that I gave for hydroxychloroquine and for the other drugs. We need to find out. We must have an open mind as far as any apathy is concerned, allopathy or Ayurvedic and other traditional systems. China had put in place a number of trials using Chinese traditional medicine. I haven't seen any dramatic results from any of them, but I think Ayurveda has a lot of potential for boosting the immune system. And so it should be tested for both prevention and perhaps for the early cases, treatment of early cases. Since there is no allopathic drug that has so far proven to be effective, Ayurveda should also be tested, and we can do it in the same kind of clinical trials that are being run for the allopathic drugs.
And then there is a second question. Again, this is an optimistic question from Shiv Kumar, but everybody wants to share this optimism. That are we Indians getting a virus? This has mutated in such a way that it's kinder to us. Is it the same virus that everybody is getting, or are you getting a different kind of virus in India?
We need more genetic sequences from India. I mentioned this global database called GISAID. I think there are about 40 sequences from India. Should probably put in some more there and compare it with the others. It is clear that the virus is evolving. All viruses mutate, but this virus is mutating at about half the rate of an influenza virus. So that's a good sign. But it's already, you can see the differences, the variations forming in the what we call clades of the virus. So there are 3 clades now which have been described.
What do you call them, if I may spell it?
Like variants, clades, CLADES.
Okay.
So there's S and G and V one is more in Europe, one is perhaps more the original one in China, but no one has really been able to correlate that with a difference in the clinical presentation uh, or differences in outcomes, mortality, for example, or in virulence or in transmissibility. These are the questions which need to be answered, and I'm sure that Indian scientists will be working on this and trying to see whether the genetic sequence has any correlation with the clinical. But as of now, what the data we have hasn't shown that it's a particular strain which is less virulent in India.
So my concluding questions. One, after this New York survey, do we now accept the inevitability that ultimately all of us will get it? At some point, enough of us will get it, so we will have herd immunity. So the only vaccination now is herd immunity. So protect the really vulnerable and old, and let the young come to work and get vaccinated.
So the word herd immunity is normally associated with vaccination programs. We talk about herd immunity for measles and polio and so on. Getting herd immunity through natural infection, of course, it is possible, and some countries toyed with that idea.
Britain did.
Yes, and they quickly realized that they would pay quite a heavy price in terms of the death rates, and therefore then they put in place the physical distancing measures that managed to slow it down. From what we've seen of the number of people in the population who are now having antibodies, and we don't know if these are protective antibodies or not, by the way, that's a different question, is 5 to 10% maybe, far away from herd immunity. We think 80% of the population needs antibodies, protective antibodies, to have any kind of herd immunity for this virus. And probably the only way of achieving that safely is through a vaccine. So I think till we have a vaccine or we have a very effective drug, we have to continue the public health measures, not of course extreme lockdowns going on forever, but a sensible and balanced approach driven by data and agile and adaptable to be able to manage this infection while going about our lives and livelihoods.
So which brings us to the concluding question quite nicely, I must say, which is India. When do we get back to work? Because we can't remain locked down forever. As you said, you can't remain locked down forever.
I don't think I can answer that question. I think the Indian government is weighing all the options. What WHO does is, of course, provide the guidance, the steps, the systems that need to be put in place, the checks and balances that need to be put in place as you open up. The one thing that we have mentioned repeatedly is that there should be no sudden lifting of lockdown. It's not like close and open and you go back to being what you were before. It's a graded approach, watching what happens as you release more and more. And it's also about putting in place certain new things which we were not used to doing in the past. I think mass gatherings, sporting events, thousands of people gathering, I don't think this is going to happen for the next few years, at least till we are confident that we can protect ourselves. Probably travel will be cut down. We're all got so used to now, communicating digitally. We may travel only for very essential things. Of course, we'll still need to travel, and other personal habits will change. I think in the West, people say, oh, can we not shake hands? I think for the next few years, I don't think anybody is going to be shaking hands. We don't have that in India because we do a namaste. And but then the masks, the hand washing, how you maintain.
I know, but at the same time, grandparents and grandchildren need to hug each other at some point.
Of course. And so I think that is what has happened today. The fear is set in so much that you can't even hug a family member. And I think that if people are healthy, within the family, of course, relationships also need to be maintained. But I think it's the understanding of when you need to be physically separate. If you have a cold and a cough and symptoms, and then you don't go near other people as far as possible, especially near the elderly. So I think a lot of adjustments will have to be made. And once again, I'd like to say that people's participation, involvement, and cooperation is going to be essential in order to sustain something like this. You can do something for a few weeks or a few months by enforcement, but on a longer term basis, it has to be voluntary. It has to be because people understand and are willing to cooperate in order to achieve the goal. And of course, that means that their needs need to be also taken care of, by society. So I think it's to be give and take. Yeah, go ahead.
Soumya, let me ask you a concluding question on a personal/professional note. When you went to WHO, leaving what actually is quite an active job as the DG of ICMR, were you looking forward to some kind of a quiet tenure of little bit of rest and recovery and learning, or being on the front lines like this? And when this happened, what was your immediate reaction? Why did this happen to me? Or would I be any place else but this at this point?
Of course, I never imagined that would be in this situation. But when I decided to come to the WHO, and I was very reluctant to leave the ICMR and come here, I think everybody knows that. But I came here because I thought this was a wonderful opportunity. Probably not too many people would get an opportunity to serve at this level in an organization that really serves the world. And it was also with the new leadership. Dr. Tedros had taken over as a Director General, had a vision really for universal health coverage and improving people's health and well-being, not just absence of disease. It's something we've said from 1948, but really talk about well-being. So I was inspired by the vision. But of course, at the beginning of this year, just after the Christmas vacation, I came back and realized that we were in the midst of the beginning of something quite serious. And as the days and weeks went by, the enormity of the fact that one is living through a pandemic, we read about the 1918 influenza pandemic, and then there have been other less serious pandemics after that. But this really turning out to be a pandemic like none we've seen before. And I feel humbled and privileged to be in a situation where I can contribute as a chief scientist of WHO to addressing the knowledge gaps, to really focusing on the research priorities, to building these global collaborations to develop new drugs, new vaccines, diagnostics, etc., and to be able to interact with so many wonderful people around the world. It's been a huge, huge learning experience for me, and I hope that we'll also leave behind something which would prove to be useful for humanity.
So you mentioned Dr. Tedros. Do you think the stick he's getting in many parts of the world is well-deserved, or do you think it's unfair?
I've been inside, seeing, as I said, every day unfolding. We have been working actually 24/7 since the beginning of January, including Dr. Tedros. He doesn't go home till the last person leaves the building. Night and day, Saturday, Sunday. And I think we have tried to be as fair as possible, as technically well informed as possible, and as transparent and inclusive as possible. WHO doesn't take sides. We're a neutral organization. We praise when praise is due and when countries deserve praise. And Dr. Tedros has often praised India for launching Ayushman Bharat. He said that in many of his speeches because he truly believes in universal health coverage. And he also comes from a background where he's lost a brother to malaria. He understands what poverty and disease are. So I think his heart is actually in the right place, and we are all trying to do the best as a team. There could have been mistakes and failings. I think everybody could. After all, it's also human error and judgment. So this is why we say we're very open to an audit and an investigation into how this pandemic was handled by WHO with a view to improving and doing better next time. I think after Ebola, there was reform, and everyone feels that the emergency program today performs much better than it was able to respond to the 14-15 Ebola outbreak. We have to keep learning and improving. But as of now, I think everyone here did their best, starting with Dr. Tedros downwards.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan. You are the pride of Indian science, the pride of Indian medicine, and pride of India. So wonderful to have you in this position. And I am so grateful again on behalf of all of us that you found time for us in such a busy period, and that too on a Saturday. So once again, good luck to you and great success to you.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you.
I have to say something as a footnote because I can't get away. I won't let you get away with this. I know that children get embarrassed when you tell people about their famous parents. So you are one of those who need, Americans have these t-shirts. If you think I'm smart, you haven't seen my mom, you haven't seen my dad. So all of you should know that Soumya should have a t-shirt that says, if you think I'm smart, you don't know my father. So her father is the brilliant Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, the parent of Indian Green Revolution, and if I may say so, somebody I'm a great fan of, and who's been a guest on Walk the Talk not once, but twice. A man with a heart of gold and a brilliant mind and great children as well. So thank you very much, Soumya.
Thank you so much. Very kind of you, Shekhar. Thank you.